At 0304 on 7 March 2009, 8 British SAS operators lay inside a half-flooded maintenance trench beneath the Eastern Freight Bridge in Kelmara, the largest river city in the Republic of Vashan. Above them, trucks rolled across steel plates slick with freezing rain. Less than 60 meters away, hidden behind the walls of a river customs warehouse, one of the most important smuggling and assassination coordination cells in the region was preparing to move before dawn. By first light, if it survived the night, the network would send cash, explosives, forged transit papers, and 2 protected couriers across the river into government-held districts. The state knew the network existed. The Americans had spent weeks building the pattern around it. But no one had managed to identify the exact room where movement became orders. The clock mattered because the bridge mattered. At 0332, the municipal barrier teams would begin preparing the east span for morning security control, and traffic routines would shift. Once that happened, the hidden cell could scatter into freight convoys, river barges, or underground access shafts beneath the customs line. The British would have one narrow window to cut the heart out of the network before the city itself helped it disappear. Kelmara was the kind of place where modern intelligence collected everything except certainty. The Americans had drone feeds, freight analytics, calls metadata, customs traffic anomalies, and enough surveillance to prove that the Eastern River Quarter was rotten from top to bottom. Trucks with clean manifests arrived too late. Fuel deliveries never matched legal output. Warehouses that claimed to process machine parts showed heat signatures on nights when no crews were scheduled. It was a perfect pattern-rich environment and a terrible target environment. Everything suspicious was surrounded by other suspicious things. MI6 found the hinge through a man nobody would have noticed in a briefing room. A deputy supervisor in the River Customs Archive had begun selling access after his brother disappeared into debt. He did not know the full network. He did not need to. He knew one bonded warehouse that continued receiving sealed dispatch satchels after its operating license had quietly lapsed. He knew one loading office on the second level was never entered through the main stairs after midnight. And he knew the old maintenance trench under the bridge still connected to a sealed service wall behind that office because the closure paperwork had been filed but never completed. That was enough for the British. Not proof for a public case, not enough for an American-style district seizure, but enough for a raid. For 12 nights, SAS surveillance teams reduced the warehouse to routine. A rear guard smoked exactly once between 2:51 and 2:55. A records clerk crossed the upper hallway carrying tea at 0301. Freight noise from the bridge above masked short metallic sounds from inside the office wall every 14 minutes, likely a hidden latch or internal gate. 2 river dogs slept beneath the side loading ramp and abandoned the spot only when fresh arrivals moved through the trench below. By the last night, the British knew more than the floor plan. They knew the rhythm. The Americans wanted a road cordon, armored police, and helicopter overwatch over both bridge approaches. The British argued that any visible tightening before contact would trigger the cell's emergency dispersal. In Kelmara, pressure traveled faster than orders. If the room mattered, it had to be taken before the district believed there was an operation at all. At 0304, underground, the lead breacher put his hand against a damp concrete panel beneath the warehouse office and felt vibration from footsteps above. The target was occupied. The room was alive. The city was still asleep enough to lie to itself for another 28 minutes. That was all the time the British needed. Chapter 2. The Americans saw a district. The British saw a door. The Eastern River Quarter defeated large systems because it never presented one problem at a time.
Smuggling, extortion, political violence, customs fraud, labor rackets, and insurgent logistics all overlapped inside the same streets, loading docks, and river lanes. To the Americans, that meant building a bigger picture. To the British, it meant shrinking the problem until one room became more important than the whole district. CIA analysts and military intelligence officers had already done serious work in Kelmara. They mapped traffic, identified false freight companies, followed suspicious mobile phones, and tied shell import firms to unexplained cash transfers in the western suburbs. Their reports were impressive. They proved corruption, collusion, and movement. They did not answer the question that mattered most on the night of a raid. Which space inside the district generated decisions quickly enough to be worth dying for? MI6 answered with something smaller and dirtier than a data set. The customs source reported that sealed dispatch satchels entered the lapsed warehouse without registry stamps and were never logged in the archive. Another contact, a fuel account clerk at the river loading yard, quietly confirmed that a second-floor office there drew power through a bypass line independent of the rest of the building. A third observation came from the SAS, not from informants. The office windows were always painted dark, but condensation gathered on the outside differently on nights when the upper room was occupied by more than 3 men. Heat meant conversation. Conversation meant command. The British built their understanding from habits no broad system could easily rank. Which stair was real and which was decoy? Which alley remained clear of drunks because local toughs kept people away from a sidewall? Which steel door sounded hollow and which one sounded loaded with shelving from the other side? The entire mission eventually narrowed to one false service wall connecting the maintenance trench to the second-floor dispatch office. That wall was the difference between a citywide chase and a controlled kill. The final plan reflected that logic. 8 SAS operators would come from below through the trench and breach directly into the rear of the dispatch room. 4 more would move into the lane behind the warehouse to kill or pin any external reaction and block escape toward the river stairs. The British would have one narrow window to cut the heart out of the network before the city itself helped it disappear. Kelmara was the kind of place where modern intelligence collected everything except certainty. The Americans had drone feeds, freight analytics, calls metadata, customs traffic anomalies, and enough surveillance to prove that the Eastern River Quarter was rotten from top to bottom. Trucks with clean manifests arrived too late. Fuel deliveries never matched legal output. Warehouses that claimed to process machine parts showed heat signatures on nights when no crews were scheduled. It was a perfect pattern-rich environment and a terrible target environment. Everything suspicious was surrounded by other suspicious things. MI6 found the hinge through a man nobody would have noticed in a briefing room. A deputy supervisor in the River Customs Archive had begun selling access after his brother disappeared into debt. He did not know the full network. He did not need to. He knew one bonded warehouse that continued receiving sealed dispatch satchels after its operating license had quietly lapsed. He knew one loading office on the second level was never entered through the main stairs after midnight. And he knew the old maintenance trench under the bridge still connected to a sealed service wall behind that office because the closure paperwork had been filed but never completed. That was enough for the British. Not proof for a public case, not enough for an American-style district seizure, but enough for a raid. For 12 nights, SAS surveillance teams reduced the warehouse to routine. A rear guard smoked exactly once between 2:51 and 2:55. A records clerk crossed the upper hallway carrying tea at 03:01. Freight noise from the bridge above masked short metallic sounds from inside the office wall every 14 minutes, likely a hidden latch or internal gate. 2 river dogs slept beneath the side loading ramp and abandoned the spot only when fresh arrivals moved through the trench below. By the last night, the British knew more than the floor plan. They knew the rhythm. The Americans wanted a road cordon, armored police, and helicopter overwatch over both bridge approaches. The British argued that any visible tightening before contact would trigger the cell's emergency dispersal. In Kelmara, pressure traveled faster than orders. If the room mattered, it had to be taken before the district believed there was an operation at all. At 0304, underground, the lead breacher put his hand against a damp concrete panel beneath the warehouse office and felt vibration from footsteps above. The target was occupied. The room was alive. The city was still asleep enough to lie to itself for another 28 minutes. That was all the time the British needed.
The charge was cut for penetration, not spectacle. It broke the inner panel, blew dust and splinters across the rear wall, and opened a shoulder-wide gap into the office before anyone inside understood the sound. The first SAS man entered low, turned left, and fired twice. A courier standing with a dispatch satchel half open collapsed against a filing cabinet. The second man drove right toward the table. The third and fourth flooded the center line. The dispatch room was larger than expected and more important. Maps of freight routes covered one wall. Sealed satchels lay open under green-shaded lamps. Cash bands, forged cargo permits, customs stamps, and coded bridge schedules were spread across 2 desks. 4 men were inside at the moment of breach. One was dead before he left his chair. A second reached for a pistol and was shot through the forearm and throat. The third tried to overturn the table and died behind it. The fourth ran for an interior steel door and managed one shout before the rear cover man dropped him at the threshold. From breach to first dominance took less than 15 seconds. Then the second layer of the office came alive. The interior steel door swung inward and 2 armed guards pushed into the room from a short records corridor. One fired high and shattered the lamp above the maps. The other got lower, better trained, and hit the rear shelving hard enough to throw paper, wood, and metal clips across the room. An SAS operator nearest the door took a splintered fragment along the side of his neck, but stayed in the stack. The lead pair crushed the doorway with controlled fire before the guards could establish the corridor. The records passage became the next objective immediately, because if it remained open, the room could not be held. Outside, almost at the same moment, the lane team made first contact. A smoker at the rear loading ramp turned toward the noise and died under suppressed fire before his weapon cleared his jacket. Another man on the river stairs shouted once and vanished back downward. The British did not chase him. They cut the angle and waited for whoever followed. That was the method. Do not fight the whole district. Fight only the geometry that matters. Inside the dispatch room, exploitation started while the corridor was still being secured. One attached intelligence specialist went straight for the satchels and stamped documents. The second pulled hard drives from a hidden desk cavity exposed by the breach blast. A wallboard marked with colored tabs turned out to be a movement matrix for bridge crossings, night barge slots, and safe inspection windows. It came off the wall whole. At 03:14 and 19 seconds, the room had ceased to function as a command post. It was now just a damaged office full of dead men, seized records, and one route the defenders had failed to protect. Somewhere beyond the records corridor, more people were waking up. That no longer changed the mission. The room that mattered was already gone. The decisive part of the raid had lasted 79 seconds. The first real resistance formed, not in the office, but below it. Men from the lower floor tried to move up the river stairs and recover either the dispatch satchels or the 2 named couriers expected to leave before dawn. They found the British lane element already waiting at the turn where the stairwell narrowed between a cracked wall and an iron support. The contact was close, ugly, and short. One militia gunman went down on the first burst. Another fell backward over the handrail and disappeared into the lower dark. A third managed to throw fire upward blindly and shattered a warehouse window, spraying the yard with glass and announcing the raid to the district at last.
That was the point at which operations of this kind either become escapes or disasters. The British had planned for exactly that moment. The room had been taken, the papers had been seized, the lower trench route was still open. Everything now depended on refusing the temptation to stay and dominate a building that no longer mattered as much as the material already in British hands. Inside the dispatch room, the named couriers were found in the records guard or trying to destroy coded note strips in a kettle flame. One was beaten to the floor and restrained. The other came out firing and died against the wall map. The intelligence specialists finished loading satchels, hard drives, stamps, and permit books into waterproof bags. One SAS operator kicked open the corridor storage cage and found reserve transit seals and 3 pistols packed for movement. They went into evidence too. Another man searching the desk line by touch in the dark after the lamps were shot out found a hidden drawer containing bridge token cards and a list of truck plate numbers already assigned to Dawn crossings. The lane team began peeling back by pairs. One pair held the stair angle while the second moved. Then they switched. A man from inside the warehouse tried to circle through the side yard and was dropped beside the loading ramp. Another got far enough to fire down into the trench mouth before a return burst drove him flat. The British never expanded the fight. They compressed it. At 0318, the troop commander gave the withdrawal call. The wounded man with the neck fragment walked under his own power. The captured courier was forced down through the breach gap feet first, then hauled into the maintenance trench. Evidence bags followed hand to hand. Behind them, the dispatch room still echoed with gunfire from defenders shooting too late at a war already decided. 2 floors above their understanding. When the first Vashian police vehicles moved toward the breach, the British were no longer fighting for the building. They were moving under it.
At 0324, the assault force emerged from the trench in a dead service yard west of the bridge line and loaded directly into municipal trucks arranged under a utilities cover story. To anyone arriving late, nothing looked decisive. No helicopters hovered. No armored column stood triumphant in the street. No public siege unfolded. That was exactly why the raid worked. It had been built to remove function, not create spectacle. By 0331, the captured courier and the seized material were inside a secure compound. The first hard drive was imaged before dawn. The satchels were opened in sequence. Inside were not ideological manifestos or propaganda drafts, but the things real clandestine networks depend on: plate numbers, crossing windows, customs marks, safe inspection codes, payment ledgers, and route substitutions for when pressure hit the bridge. The room the Americans had been trying to locate for weeks turned out not to be a symbolic headquarters at all. It was something much more dangerous. It was the point where movement became permission. The consequences moved fast. One truck company on the ledgers was rolled up before midday. A customs sergeant disappeared into custody by noon. By evening, 2 apartments on the western bank had been raided after their permit numbers matched entries from the seized board. A finance clerk tied to the same courier route fled and was caught at the bus terminal with bridge token cards sewn into his coat lining. The American advisors who reviewed the first exploitation summaries understood immediately what had happened. Their systems had correctly described the district as corrupt, active, and strategically important. The British had identified the one room inside it that converted corruption into operational effect. That was the divide in practice. One side built architecture, the other found the switch. What stayed with the Americans was not just the speed of the assault, it was the selectivity of the violence. The British had not tried to cleanse the entire river quarter or kill every armed man under the bridge. They had cut the network where it generated continuity: forged passage, courier timing, protected movement, and authenticated crossing. Lose fighters and a network survives. Lose its route authority and it begins to choke on its own confusion. By sunrise, bridge traffic in Kalmara looked ordinary. Trucks rolled. Police waved vehicles through. River barges moved under gray water and dirty morning light.
Yet, under that appearance, one of the city's most valuable covert arteries had already been severed. The raid had taken minutes. The effect would spread for months. Chapter 6. The Difference Between Watching and Touching. At 0710, the CIA liaison assigned to the Kelmara task group stood over a table covered in bridge schedules, customs seals, and route ledgers taken from the dispatch room. On the wall behind him, a live overhead image of the eastern quarter showed roads, warehouses, flood barriers, and the bridge itself in perfect sterile detail. The image was sharp. It was also, in a way that every serious intelligence officer eventually learns to respect, not enough. The Americans had seen the quarter. They had mapped its dishonesty, tracked its suspicious traffic, and correctly understood that a critical network was operating through it. But seeing is not the same as touching. The British had taken the one step that broad systems often delay too long in taking. They had reduced the whole problem to a room, a wall, a route below it, and a narrow minute before the city shifted its own rhythm. The institutional contrast that emerged from Kelmara was familiar, but still uncomfortable. The CIA and its military partners pursued confidence through scope, layers, and accumulation. The MI6 and the SAS pursued action through specificity, compromise, and human texture. The American way was built to dominate wide battle space. The British way, at its best, was built to exploit dirty local certainty before it dissolved. One side asked how the quarter functioned. The other asked which door mattered at 0313. Neither method was meaningless without the other. The British did not discover the district in a vacuum. The Americans had already built the broad field in which the target could be understood. But on the night itself, broad knowledge stopped at the edge of decision. The British crossed that edge with 12 men, a trench route, one small charge, and the willingness to arrive where the target felt safest. Over the next weeks, protected smuggling across the eastern bridge dropped sharply. 2 related assassination attempts failed after couriers lost authenticated movement routes. Customs corruption did not disappear. The city remained compromised, but one hidden office that had turned paperwork into violence no longer existed. That was why operations like Kelmara stay alive in professional memory. Not because they are loud, but because they are exact. The room was found, the route was used, the right men were killed or taken, the records were exploited before dawn. A district that had hidden behind complexity was reduced to something brutally simple. At 0304, the warehouse in Kelmara was just another dark building beneath a wet bridge. 28 minutes later, the network inside it had lost the one thing it could not replace quickly enough to survive. Not manpower, not weapons, permission.